The first person to notice was not a genius, not a prophet, not even a lead astronomer on duty. It was a graduate student named Imani Okoye, alone in the cold control room of Cerro Tololo, rubbing her eyes at 2:13 in the morning and wondering whether exhaustion had finally begun to bend the sky. She had been tracking a routine calibration field, one of those unglamorous tasks that keep science honest. No explosions, no exotic transients, no headlines. Just stars so familiar they were practically furniture. She had run the same slice of sky through the telescope's software hundreds of times. That was why the error made her sit up. One star near the edge of the frame was off by a fraction of a degree. At first, she assumed the mount had slipped. Then she checked the plate solution. Perfect. She recalibrated. Same result. She pulled archived images from the previous week, then the previous month, then 10 years back. The star had always occupied the same precise point relative to its neighbors, locked into the vast mechanical patience of the cosmos. Tonight, it was somewhere else. Not much farther. Just enough to be impossible. Imani stared at the screen until her coffee went cold. Stars did move, of course, but not like this. Proper motion happened over centuries, millennia, in tiny drifts only instruments could resolve. This was different. This was visible. If a human being had compared the sky on Monday to the sky on Friday, they would have noticed. If they compared it to an hour ago, they might notice that too. She called her supervisor, an astrophysicist named Tom Armitage, who answered with the voice of a man dragged upward from deep sleep and no interest in miracles. He told her to check atmospheric distortion, software logs, timestamp synchronization, and every other earthly explanation before she disturbed anyone else. Imani did all of it. She even walked outside and looked up with her own eyes. The constellation was wrong. She stayed very still in the Chilean sky, her breath fogging in the mountain air, while the old arrangement she had known since childhood seemed to loosen in front of her like threads pulled from cloth. By dawn, observatories in Hawaii, La Palma, South Africa, and Western Australia had confirmed the same anomaly. The initial chatter on internal networks was restrained, the way scientists talk when reality has started misbehaving, and no one wants to be the first to sound irrational. Some argued for lensing events. Others proposed an unknown solar system effect, a flaw in timing infrastructure, sabotage, data poisoning, a military experiment. One particularly embarrassed post suggested mass fatigue, as though thousands of astronomers across 6 continents had simultaneously become incompetent. But the sky kept moving. Over the next 48 hours, every major telescope on Earth pivoted from scheduled programs to emergency verification. Amateur astronomers joined in next, then civilians with phone cameras. The story escaped the professional channels before anyone could shape it into something calm. By the third night, children were standing in suburban yards, pointing upward and telling their parents that Orion's belt looked bent. News anchors tried to speak in measured tones, while split screens showed live sky feeds from different hemispheres. Religious leaders went on television. Government spokespeople said they were monitoring the situation. Markets dipped. Airports reported distracted pilots. Sleep researchers published statements about anxiety. Social media became a flood of fake explanations, bad diagrams, prophecies, panic jokes, and one increasingly common phrase: the stars are rearranging themselves. Tom flew to Chile 2 days later, not because he believed the universe was acting with intent, but because he trusted Imani's refusal to dramatize. She met him at the observatory, wearing the same sweater she had slept in and carrying a tablet full of overlays. He expected fear. What he found was something stranger and more dangerous. Wonder sharpened by method, she walked him through the data wall. Hundreds of stars had shifted, not randomly, not due to perspective, not because Earth's atmosphere was distorting incoming light. Spectroscopic measurements still placed them at their original distances. Radial velocities did not match the apparent changes in position. Parallax measurements broke under the contradiction. The stars were where they had always been, and yet from Earth they were also somewhere else. It's as if the sky is being redrawn, Tom said, before he could stop himself. Imani nodded. That's the least absurd sentence anyone said to me all day. He spent the next 6 hours trying to destroy her conclusion. He failed professionally, then enthusiastically. By the end of the night, he had stopped looking for instrumental causes and started asking a question he hated. If this was not motion in the stars themselves, then what exactly was moving? The answer came from a radio observatory in New Mexico, where an engineer named Lena Vukovic was comparing optical shifts with deep space background data and noticed that the stellar repositioning aligned with minute fluctuations in electromagnetic noise. Not enough to register as a signal at first glance. Too structured to be noise after prolonged analysis. She mapped the fluctuations against a moving star field and found correlation. Then she did something reckless and brilliant. She fed both sets of data into pattern recognition software trained on compressed language structures, music intervals, symbolic grammar, and information theory. The system returned an output no one knew what to do with. The stars were not shifting independently. They were changing in groups, with spacing ratios that repeated across regions of sky too distant from one another to share any physical mechanism known to science. Certain stars moved, paused, and moved again in ways that preserved angular relationships. It looked less like natural drift and more like placement, like strokes, like shapes being written on a sphere. Lena sent the analysis to every major observatory before anyone could stop her. Within 3 hours, half the astrophysics community called it premature nonsense, and the other half quietly began testing it with their own models. By sunrise, the ones calling it nonsense had gone silent, because once you stopped asking how stars were moving and started asking what the movements resembled, the pattern became impossible to ignore. They were forming geometry. Not the simple sacred geometry beloved by mystics and graphic designers, but layered structures that repeated at prime intervals, arcs nested inside polygons, clusters aligned on ratios that mirrored mathematical constants too precisely for chance. Regions of the sky that had once hosted unrelated stars now participated in coordinated spatial relationships, like pieces of single design emerging from dimensions too large for a human mind to hold at once. Imani watched the renderings with a tightness in her chest that felt almost like grief. The old sky was vanishing night by night. The constellations humanity had inherited from myth, agriculture, navigation, empire, poetry, and childhood were being overwritten in real time by something vast enough to treat them as temporary markings. But it was not destruction. That was the unsettling part. Nothing was being erased. It was being arranged. Around the world, people responded according to whatever story they already used to survive reality. Some called it first contact. Some called it judgment. Some called it proof that the universe was a simulation finally exposing its grid. Others simply went outside and cried, because even without explanation, they could feel that history had divided. There was the age when the stars were fixed, and there was whatever came next. Governments formed emergency committees. Military agencies denied involvement with such urgency that everyone briefly suspected them more. The United Nations convened an international scientific task force, though by then the task force was mostly trying to catch up with conversations already happening among observatories, universities, hobbyists, cryptographers, and stunned teenagers on rooftop live streams. It was in one of those task force meetings, 6 days after the first sighting, that the mood shifted from bewilderment to terror. A mathematician from Kyoto, Professor Seiji Watanabe, presented a model that tracked the stellar changes not on a flat projection, but on a dynamically curved reference field accounting for Earth's orbital motion, axial tilt, and local observation windows. When corrected that way, the repositioning pattern stopped looking like abstract geometry and began to resemble a message being optimized for a single species observing from a single planet, not for the galaxy. For us, the room went quiet enough to hear cooling fans in the wall displays. Watanabe showed how specific arrangements only resolve when viewed from Earth-based coordinates over successive nights, as if the phenomenon expected the observer to be standing on this world, rotating with it, waiting through darkness. Even the timing matched human behavior. Major changes happened during local night across densely populated regions, handing the spectacle from hemisphere to hemisphere like a relay. "It is intentional," he said finally, his voice calm in that precise way people become calm when they are close to panic. "Not merely artificial. Intentional in relation to human observation." The distinction landed hard. Artificial could still mean machinery, accident, experiment. Intentional meant audience. Tom looked at Imani across the conference display, and for the first time since his career began, he saw a scientific problem that behaved like eye contact. The next phase was uglier. Once the idea of intention entered the public sphere, everything accelerated. Every pattern became a candidate message. Every movement spawned thousands of interpretations. Fringe groups claimed exclusive understanding. States censored and recensored sky footage. A few cities saw riots after rumors spread that the final arrangement marked impact zones or divine selection. Space agencies pleaded for patience while privately admitting they had no meaningful leverage over events unfolding across apparent interstellar scales. The astronomers kept working. Imani, Tom, Lena, and Watanabe ended up in the same secured research hub in Geneva, sleeping in shifts, surviving on bitter coffee, and the slowly collapsing etiquette of exhausted people. They built models that compared the stellar choreography to every known form of symbolic compression. Language families, DNA encoding, pulsar timing, ancient numeral systems, quantum error correction lattices, whale song, visual cortex mapping. Most outputs were noise. A few were eerie. None were decisive. Then Imani noticed the pauses. The stars were not merely moving into position. Some were holding, as if waiting. She overlaid the global timeline of changes against human observation density, using weather satellites, internet traffic, public live streams, telescope submissions, and even mobile camera metadata scraped through emergency research authorizations that would scandalize later generations. The pattern was clear. The sky did not advance uniformly. It slowed when cloud cover obscured major landmasses. It accelerated when millions of people were watching. The room stared at her results in horrified silence. "It knows whether it's being seen," Lena whispered. No one contradicted her. That finding changed the emotional center of the crisis. Humanity had been acting like spectators to a cosmic event. Suddenly it felt as though the event was responsive. Children waving laser pointers at the stars seemed less innocent. National plans to dim cities and reduce observation looked childish, like people hiding under blankets from thunder. Somewhere between superstition and systems analysis, a new fear emerged. Not that something was coming, but that it had already arrived and was patiently teaching the sky how to speak in front of us. Tom, who had spent his life dismissing language like destiny and calling the universe indifferent with almost religious conviction, began to break in quiet places, not outwardly. He still chaired meetings, still corrected equations, still argued about error bars. But one night Imani found him alone in the cafeteria staring through the dark glass at the reflection of ceiling lights. "When I was 9, he said without looking at her, "my mother taught me the constellations during a blackout in Yorkshire. She told me the stars looked the same to Romans and shepherds and sailors, and to anyone who had ever been lost. She said that was the comfort of them. No matter what happened on Earth, they stayed." He smiled, but only with one side of his mouth. "I built a career on that feeling, and called it objectivity." Imani sat across from him. "Maybe the comfort was never that they stayed. Maybe it was that we believed they did." He laughed once, quietly, and wiped at his eyes as if irritated by dust. On the 11th night, the pattern resolved enough to provoke a dangerous hypothesis. The geometry was not arbitrary mathematics. It was a map of transformations, a sequence of topological states. Watanabe described it as instruction, without language. Lena compared it to watching higher-dimensional shadows projected into familiar space. Imani said it looked like a sentence trying to become visible without using words. They projected the most stable arrangement into a simulation environment and let an AI search for a meaningful interpretation under physical constraints. After 7 minutes, the system produced a model none of them liked. The arrangement resembled not a message to be read, but a demonstration of displacement, a path from one configuration to another, a route not for ships crossing space, but for space itself to fold through a set of precise relationships. No engine signatures were detected. No mass anomalies approached the solar system. Yet the stellar choreography corresponded disturbingly well with equations for metric deformation, lens structures, and energy boundaries that modern physics considered theoretically imaginable and practically impossible. Unless the stars were not being moved, unless their positions were being used as anchors, the universe might not be showing humanity that something had traveled here. It might be showing humanity how arrival works. That conclusion remained classified for almost 4 hours, which in the modern age counts as a miracle. Then a leak hit every major platform on Earth, and the world changed again. People stopped asking what the stars meant and began asking whether the sky itself was being prepared. Curfew spread through some cities, festivals through others. There were candlelit vigils, mass observatories and football stadiums, emergency sermons, beach parties, bunker sales, births broadcast under moving constellations, divorces, reconciliations, resignations, proposals, confessions. For a brief and astonishing stretch of time, billions of people looked upward together. The old divisions did not disappear, but they loosened beneath a shared awareness. So primal it felt prehistoric. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Why tell us? If a civilization had the power to manipulate perception on an astronomical scale, why announce itself in a way that required patience, mathematics, and night? Why not speak directly? Why not arrive with a blunt force of certainty? The answer emerged from the final movement. On the 15th night, just after midnight UTC, the shifting ceased. Every observatory reported stability. The sky held a new arrangement unlike any chart in human history. Dense arc-spanning hemispheres, bright reference points repositioned into impossible symmetries, vast empty corridors where familiar alignments had once stitched stories together. Then, at the center of the visible pattern, one star brightened. Not explosively, gently, like a thought becoming conscious. Its light oscillated in intervals already embedded in the previous day's geometry. Lena decoded the pulse lengths first. They mapped to a recursive structure the team had overlooked because it was too simple. Not language, not formula, something closer to pedagogy. Step, observe, repeat. The entire transformation had been slowed down to match human comprehension. The pauses, the responsiveness, the geometric scaffolding, the observational dependence. It was not a threat display. It was not even, in the strictest sense, a message. It was an introduction. An intelligence beyond any human framework had not arrived to conquer or to warn. It had realized that a small, frightened civilization on a wet planet looked at the sky for meaning, and so it had chosen the oldest, gentlest interface available. It used the stars because the stars were already sacred to us. It made the impossible gradual because our minds break under too much wonder at once. It waited when clouds cover the earth because teaching requires a student. It moved only as fast as we could bear to watch. When Watanabe said this aloud, no one in the room answered. Some ideas do not enter as arguments. They enter as weather. Outside, Geneva was awake. So was Nairobi, Sao Paulo, Reykjavik, Mumbai, Anchorage, Seoul, Cape Town, and 1,000 places too small for headlines. People stood on rooftops and in deserts and parking lots and ship decks and refugee camps, all beneath the same rewritten sky, watching a brightness pulse at the center of a pattern no human culture had invented. Tom felt, with humiliating intensity, the return of his childhood, not the memory of it, but the sensation itself, the terror of being small under a vast night, and the peace that sometimes follows when smallness no longer feels like failure. He understood then that science had not been betrayed. It had been invited further. What stood before them was not magic replacing knowledge. It was knowledge encountering a scale of intention it had never needed to describe. Imani walked outside with the others and tilted her head back until her neck hurt. Around her, people were silent in many languages. Some prayed, some recorded, some simply stared, stripped for a moment of opinion. The brightened star pulsed again and again, each interval measured, patient, unmistakably deliberate. "We see that you are looking," it seemed to say, "and we are trying to be seen." The final motion came just before dawn in South America, just after evening in East Asia, caught live by enough cameras that no one would ever again be able to pretend it had not happened. The central geometry did not open. It unfolded. Space near the pulsing star seemed to turn softly inside out, not tearing, not blazing, but revealing depth where no depth should exist. A dark shape emerged, too large to be called a vessel, too coherent to be called a phenomenon. It was visible only by the way starlight curved around it, as if the thing entering our understanding had not yet chosen a final form. No attack followed, no decree, no thunderous transmission. Only one more pulse from the brightened star, then stillness. Humanity watched the sky until sunrise washed the pattern from sight, and for the first morning in all recorded history, daylight felt like an interruption. People went to work when they could. Children asked whether the stars would move again that night. Financial markets reopened. Hospitals remained full of the ordinary heartbreaks and ordinary mercies of being alive. The world did not end. It became impossible to call ordinary. In the weeks that followed, astronomers would become the reluctant interpreters of a new epoch. The first witnesses would be interviewed, doubted, celebrated, exhausted. Old maps of the sky would be preserved like family photograph of a house that no longer stands. Philosophy, theology, politics, and physics would all scramble to claim relevance. None would emerge unchanged. But that first night will remain the purest part of the story, not the arrival itself, not the speculation or the fear, just the moment a tired student looked at a familiar field of stars and realized the universe was no longer pretending not to notice us. And perhaps, in some strange way, it never had. Perhaps the silence had not been empty. Perhaps it had been careful. Because across all those centuries, when we named the constellations, traced myths through cold light, and told our children that the stars stayed where they were, we had assumed stability was the universe's default language. We were wrong. Stability was only the page. Intention was the writing. And on one impossible sequence of nights, the heavens began to write back.